Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And let me extend, as I always do, a particular Carnegie welcome to any viewers who may be live streaming from India, from Pakistan, or from China, since they are, after all, the three places that are at the core of my colleague Ashley Tellis's new report, and also of the conversation about it that we're going to have today. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies here at Carnegie. And it's a particular pleasure to do this, not just because the issues are so salient at a time of, let's face it, intensifying geopolitical rivalries and questions about nuclear buildouts and nuclear doctrines in Asia, but also because this report is likely, I think, to stand as a definitive treatment of the subject. And it's certainly going to spur a lot of discussion and debate in the bargain. And I know, because I know him, that that was precisely Ashley's intent. Now, the report is called Striking Asymmetries, Nuclear Transitions in Southern Asia. And let me just tell you briefly what it does by way of introduction. Ashley puts it very nicely, I think, in the framing section of the report. He says it examines the transitions in the nuclear weapons programs of three countries, as I said, China, India, and Pakistan, over the last 2 decades. And in particular, it uses an inflection point from 25 years ago, the May 1998 Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests, as a point of reference and a point of departure. Now, I don't want to date my age here, but I do remember those days. I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard in 1998, trying to finish up a book on the legacies of the people who built China's first nuclear weapons and delivery systems in the 1960s and 1970s. And while China then had what scholars like Ian Johnston at Harvard used to call a limited nuclear deterrent, a great deal in China's force structure, strategy, and doctrine are quite clearly in motion. And so, as Ashley writes, although India and Pakistan have openly developed their deterrence since 1998, the transformations in China's nuclear weapons program began earlier. So, in a nutshell, Ashley's study takes a very carefully crafted crack at understanding the character and extent of these countries' nuclear evolution. And he relies, by the way, not just on public sources, but on interviews with policymakers and strategic planners and military officials in all three countries. And of course, with American and European government officials who follow strategic issues in Southern Asia. The report, which I highly recommend to you, looks at both declaratory and operational nuclear doctrines. And by the way, it explores fissile material stockpiles, weapons designs, and inventories, delivery systems, command and control arrangements, strategic defenses, and a whole lot more. So ultimately, the report assesses the impact of the evolving nuclear transitions on crisis stability. So I'm delighted to help Ashley roll it out. And I'm especially delighted that we're joined for a discussion of it by three of the very best. First, and you can see them on screen, Carnegie's very own Tong Zhao. Second, my very old friend Rakesh Sood, now retired from the Indian Diplomatic Service. And of course, Rabia Akhtar, a leading scholar now based at the University of Lahore. So team, welcome and welcome all. And Ashley, this is your report. So I thought I will avoid my usual temptation to begin as an active moderator. Instead, we should let you have the first word and then ultimately the last word. And so I thought we'd start by just having you walk us through the report, the top lines, why you wrote it and how and what you're driving to do, and then we'll invite comments sequentially from our three discussants. So with that, Ashley, let me hand it to you.
Well, thanks, Evan. It's really wonderful to be here, both with my colleagues as well as those who have joined us that I can't see on screen. to talk about this report, which, as I mentioned in the book, really has been, in the making for some 20 years, because the evolution and the developments that the book focuses on have been underway for a long time. Uh, I want to cut to the chase in the interests of time and tell you what this book has attempted to do. It's attempted to map the changes in doctrine, the changes in capability, and the changes in operational impact as a result of the transformations in the Chinese, Indian, and Pakistani nuclear arsenals. But it doesn't look at it in a purely dyadic perspective, China and India, India and Pakistan, even though that is very much part of the detailed analysis in the volume. Rather, it sets these dyadic interactions in a larger strategic context. And the larger strategic context is the challenges facing the global nuclear order, which all three of the panelists who are going to speak have actually written on, and of course, intensifying US China competition. In fact, one of the interesting things that the volume documents is that each of these three countries, China, India, and Pakistan, are faced with a multiplicity of security challenges. And the dyadic framing sometimes does not do justice to the multiplicity of the challenges. For China, of course, the United States is front and center in terms of its nuclear transformation. But Russia, which historically was part of China's calculations, still remains in the wings. And although Sino-Russian relations today are reasonably good, if you are a Chinese strategic planner, you cannot afford to forget that there is a major nuclear power on your northern borders. China also has to think about India, which is an emerging nuclear power. And interestingly, China has always considered the other Asian rivals as being important foci of its nuclear interests. China has in the past paid attention to what's happening in Japan, of course to India since 1974, and increasingly now to Australia. So China has a complex threat environment, and it has to build its nuclear capabilities to take into account all these players, and especially their relationships with the US. For India, of course, China has become more and more important in ways that was not the case historically, both at a strategic level and at a nuclear level. And of course, there is a traditional rivalry with Pakistan. In fact, the Pakistani program is what triggered the Indian decision to weaponize in the 1980s. And even Pakistan, although it is predominantly focused on India as a challenger, in times gone by, it has been compelled to think about the United States as a strategic challenge, particularly because of developments that occurred in the last 20 years, the war in Afghanistan, the fears that the United States might attempt to seize Pakistan's nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. Though the concern about the United States has waxed and waned depending on the geopolitical circumstances of the day. So there are a multiplicity of players involved, and there are a multiplicity of challenges that each of these players is attempting to develop their nuclear weapons to service. What is the core of the transformation that is taking place? I would argue that the core of the transformation is taking place along three dimensions. The first is that the character of the arsenals themselves are changing. 25 years ago, the arsenals were very small and very simple, almost token arsenals, designed primarily as existential deterrents. The weapons existed, the existence of weapons was supposed to deter, and that was it. Today, the arsenals are both growing and are increasingly diversified. It's not enough to just have missiles or aircraft, or missiles and aircraft. They're increasingly being complemented by sea-based systems. And even within each leg of the triad, there is a remarkable diversity of weapons that is entering the arsenals in each of these countries. Obviously, there's considerable variation when you look at China vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis Pakistan. But I think a broad trend is that force sizes are increasing, beyond the early expectations of what an existential deterrent or a minimal deterrent required, and the forces are becoming increasingly diversified. So that's point number one. The second dimension of change pertains to nuclear strategies. 25 years ago, in each of the three countries, the nuclear strategies that were pursued were very simple. They were retaliation only, and they were basically meant to deter the use of nuclear weapons on oneself. Today, the strategies have become more complex. And in the case of China, China is certainly acquiring the capabilities to exercise some forms of limited nuclear use. I'll say a little more about that in the next few minutes. Pakistan has moved away from a focus on simple counter-value retaliation to a more complex set of nuclear strategies, which also involve limited nuclear use, and so on and so forth. And India seems to be the last outlier here, but even the Indian posture is marked by some ambiguities that has triggered a good deal of discussion in the strategic literature recently. So the simple nuclear strategies that focused on retaliation have now given way to more complex strategies along a spectrum. And all three states are acquiring the capabilities to service the complexity of these strategies. And the third dimension I would flag is the speed of retaliation. 25 years ago, all three states were quite comfortable with the idea of delayed retaliation. There was no need for an urgent nuclear response in case of a crisis. China was, of course, led the way throughout the Cold War in maintaining a very, very long fuse with respect to reactive nuclear use. The same was true of India and Pakistan. Their ambitions were to use nuclear weapons not before it was necessary, and even when it was necessary, to give themselves the required time to be able to make those decisions. Today, the speed of response has changed considerably. China is moving in the direction of greater alacrity of response. Even India, which is the most conservative of the three states in terms of the changes of its posture, is moving in a direction where it wants to be able to respond rapidly. And of course, Pakistan, because of its own vulnerabilities, has always held out the threat of using nuclear weapons first and possibly even early in the midst of an acute subcontinental crisis. So I would say along these three dimensions, there have been very significant changes. And this obviously has varying impacts on stability that, I hope commentators will speak to and we can discuss in the Q&A. So what is the good news in all of this? Or is this simply a story of unremitting, depression? I would say there are some elements of good news still, and those need to be kept in focus. The first element, which I think is reassuring, is that all three states still view nuclear weapons primarily as political instruments of deterrence, rather than military instruments for warfighting. And even though there are some variations with respect to China and Pakistan on this question, I think the fact has to be noted that the emphasis in all the southern Asian states on deterrence as opposed to warfighting is really what distinguishes their nuclear strategies from the current nuclear strategies of the United States and Russia. The US and Russia still today focus on denial. Those nuclear weapons that they possess obviously are meant primarily for deterrence, but should deterrence fail, their nuclear weapons are intended to service certain operational objectives, eliminate the adversary's nuclear weapons, and thereby either produce a margin of advantage or limit the damage that they themselves can suffer. China, India, and Pakistan have a rather different view about the use of nuclear weapons. They're still more political than operational devices. So that's, I think, one important piece of good news. The second is that centralized control over nuclear weapons is both persistent and tight in all three countries. This has always been true in China and in India. And Pakistan was viewed as the outlier. But I think a close examination of the kind that I have conducted in the writing of this report really shows that there has been no diminution in centralized control, even in Pakistan. And I would make the argument that even if conventional war were to break out, Pakistan is unlikely to go down the road of pre-delegating nuclear use authority to field commanders, as was often feared about a decade or a decade and a half ago. So that's the second piece of good news. And the third piece of good news is that although the nuclear inventories are expanding in size, the speed of the buildup is still relatively slow compared to the pace of the transformation that we saw during the Cold War. Now, obviously, we are talking of three countries with unique strategic histories and unique threats. So there is a considerable variation in speed. And the most dramatic transformations, of course, are taking place in China. The accretions to the arsenal are fastest in the case of China. I would hypothesize that the accretions to the arsenal are next fastest in Pakistan, and they are slowest in the case of India. In fact, when I began to do the research, I expected that I would find a much larger and faster Indian nuclear buildup than turned out to be the case. And in the book, I spent quite some time trying to figure out why India has moved with such deliberation. And I think there are two explanations for that. One, because I believe India is still ambivalent about nuclear weapons in many ways. And this goes back to both historical legacies and so on and so forth. But the second is that India also has significant conventional military advantages vis-a-vis its principal strategic threats, both China and Pakistan. The story involving Pakistan is obvious. India is a bigger country, it has bigger military forces, and so it's not compelled to think of nuclear weapons as being antidotes for security. But what is often forgotten is that India also has significant conventional advantages vis-a-vis China in terms of its ability to defend its frontiers quite effectively through the use of conventional forces alone. And so nuclear weapons for India are really additional means of reassurance rather than devices that need to be used in order to deter a Chinese threat. So when one sort of does the net assessment, there are clearly issues for concern, but there are also elements of reassurance that we ought to recognize when we think about the changes that are taking place in the region. I want to end by just flagging three issues for the future that are worth paying attention to. The first is the eventual size of the Chinese nuclear arsenal and the eventual posture that China will hew to in the context of its nuclear transformation. The size is a very interesting question. We forget, but throughout the Cold War, the Chinese nuclear arsenal probably never exceeded 200 nuclear weapons. Today, the assumption is that China is moving to build a force that will be somewhere between 700 to 1,000 nuclear weapons. And even that does not necessarily constitute the terminus. China could expand even further. Of course, if it begins to build a force beyond 700 nuclear weapons, it will need to go back to producing fissile materials and so on and so forth. But it can certainly build up its nuclear forces in ways that are far more significant than was the case during the Cold War. So we don't know what the end state of the Chinese nuclear force is going to be and what the character of the posture is going to be, because at least some segments of the Chinese nuclear force are moving towards the capacity for very rapid retaliation, including, launch and warning and possibly launch under attack. And the new Chinese investments, particularly in land-based forces, which involve silo-based systems, which in theory could be vulnerable to counter-force attacks by an adversary, are the elements of the Chinese arsenal that are primed for the quickest response. And if China actually moves towards a launch on warning or a launch under attack capability, then of course the fears about instability could become particularly acute, especially in the context of US-China crises. So that is a big area of uncertainty that I think we need to watch. There's a second area that I want to flag, which pertains to China, and that is China's theater nuclear systems, which are now increasingly counterforce capable, particularly vis-a-vis regional adversaries. They have extreme accuracies of the kind that we have not seen in Chinese strategic systems before, and they're increasing in numbers. And the only thing that I think would deter China from using them in a counterforce role is the fact that its adversaries' nuclear assets are generally opaque. But if that opacity were breached, then I think splendid counterforce capabilities would come within reach. So that's something to look at. On the second big uncertainty is India-China rivalry and the future of the India-China rivalry, which is clearly intensifying. And the role of nuclear weapons in that rivalry will be something to watch for. Thus far, we've avoided nuclear weapons becoming the centerpiece in Sino-Indian competition. But if Sino-Indian competition does not abate, then the future of nuclear weapons in that competition is something that one needs to pay attention to. And I think in this context, India will have to make some hard decisions about both the future of its force structure as well as the issues relating to nuclear testing. And last, with respect to Pakistan, I think, and I've made the argument in the report, that the real concern about Pakistan is not its nuclear weapons, but rather the use to which it puts its nuclear weapons, which is essentially as license to support low-intensity wars against India, which then open the door for Indian conventional retaliation and then the possibilities of Pakistani nuclear use. So these are three uncertainties, or three baskets of uncertainties, that I want to leave our audience with, things to think about as we think about the future. So thank you very much, Evan, and thanks to all my colleagues who have joined us on this panel.
Well, thanks, Ashley. I should actually be thanking you, not you thanking me, but that was a fabulous overview of the report. But also you put a set of very provocative and interesting issues for debate and discussion on the table. I think what we'll do is we'll go sequentially, as we were saying before, through the panel. So we'll start with Tong. And you have a big challenge because I think a lot of people think they look at China as unusually opaque. If it were so opaque, you wouldn't be able to do the work that you do, studying it. But I'm hoping you'll comment specifically on the report. Second, on things that Ashley said about the Chinese arsenal that resonate with you. But then third, about the interactive element, because of course this is a report about, it's a book about Southern Asia. But for China, there's this other player that's sitting out there, as Ashley not just alluded to, but mentioned, which is the United States, that's driving a lot of this. And so that interactive element between the US-China dynamic on the one hand, and then the cascade effects back down into Southern Asia, I think is something that's going to be important to focus on. And so with that, why don't I turn it to Tong and take us away.
Well, thank you so much, Evan. Thank you so much, Ashley, and congratulations on this excellent report. I think the Chinese nuclear policy is indeed become more opaque, so I can continue pretending that I know what China's nuclear policy is, and no one can prove that I'm wrong. This is really indeed a wonderful report, very comprehensive, very deep, and I have learned a lot. There are just so many useful insights. The conclusion, Ashley, you drew from the report is very reassuring. You convincingly said the two nuclear dyads in Southern Asia between China and India and India and Pakistan, their deterrence relationships are more or less stable. And I think I very much agree that as long as the three countries continue to see nuclear weapons as mostly political tools rather than war-fighting weapons, then we have a good chance of maintaining this stability. A small difference I would dare to propose is, well, in some cases, to attach too much political value to nuclear weapons could also be a problem. And I think this is exactly the problem we are having today with regard to the US-China dyad. I believe, again, this is my speculation that no one can prove wrong. But my speculation is one important driver of China's recent reported nuclear expansion is precisely that the Chinese leadership is now attaching a lot of political value to nuclear weapons because China believes that the US-led Western countries are becoming more politically hostile to China. And China seems to believe that Russia's big nuclear arsenal made Western countries deal with Russia more carefully and with more respect. So a bigger Chinese arsenal can also help push back against the perceived Western political hostility so that they will speak with China equally and fairly and start to really listen to China and respect China's core interests. It's not really driven by military level calculations. That's my personal belief. But the question is India going to appreciate that political driver of the recent buildup? Or would India believe China is adopting or shifting towards a more aggressive nuclear military strategy? As you demonstrated in your research, China may have that potential to threaten Indian nuclear forces, making them not really survivable. And in this regard, we do have a new situation regarding China because the threat of or the risk of a real military conflict between China and the United States in the foreseeable future has become much greater in recent years than before, not least because of the Taiwan Strait issue. And here, of course, from the Chinese perspective, China's gaining increasing conventional advantage with the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. So China is now, pressed to consider nuclear first use, but China worries exactly that the United States may be losing its conventional superiority, and the U.S. may have an increasing incentive to consider nuclear escalation threat in a future conventional war with China. So China may, from Beijing's perspective, China may need to develop some, proportional retaliation capability. If U.S. starts a limited regional nuclear attack, China should be able to respond in kind. And that, I think, is driving a growing interest in having escalation management capabilities on the Chinese side. That will be a new thinking here. And the type of capability that China develops for crisis management capabilities could be then viewed by India as evidence of China acquiring first strike or damage limitation capability against India. So I think there are plenty room of exaggerated threat perception here. And here, in the U.S.-China case, their bilateral military competition has shifted from an asymmetric competition, where China focused on developing asymmetric capabilities against the United States, towards a more equal and symmetric competition, in the sense that China now thinks it is a major power and will become a leading power, and China needs and deserves a comprehensive, a military power that is strong comprehensively in all major areas. And one illustration of that is China is becoming more interested in all kinds of missile defense technologies. And if China starts to have missile defense, of course, initially, China right now is focused mostly on theater missile defense system, and seems to be already deploying many of the systems in larger and larger numbers. That wouldn't cause a concern to India's nuclear deterrent in the near term, but Chinese experts appear to be keeping the option open for even more ambitious missile defense plans going forward. I wonder if that long-term possibility is going to make India start to also prepare for hedging against that scenario. And of course, you talk about missile accuracy. That's a major issue. Your calculation shows that if Chinese missiles are not very accurate, the Indian deterrence is very credible. But if accuracy increases, it could significantly reduce Indians' credibility. And indeed, Chinese nuclear missile accuracy is improving significantly, but we don't know whether that is because of simply technological development and evolution, or it is driven by some strategy to acquire counterforce capability. And I think all three countries' nuclear accuracy will increase over time as technologies advance. So how do we separate natural technological evolution from deliberate strategy? I think it's the important question to answer. And the geopolitical developments, I think, could also cause worst case thinking. We already know that the US starts to worry about Chinese-Russian nuclear coordination. And China is already worrying about US-India military cooperation against China. So would India also worry about increasing potential nuclear coordination between China and Pakistan? I think that could be a future driver of instability. My last quick point is about the positive side, which is no first use. You also mentioned in your excellent report that this is a major stabilizing factor. Both China and India have adopted and implemented it in good faith, largely speaking, for many years. Also, I think a future uncertainty is the line between nuclear use and non-nuclear use is becoming blurry. No first use policy, it explicitly prohibits the first use of nuclear weapons, but it doesn't really prohibit the threat of nuclear use in a conventional war. And in many cases, it's the threat of nuclear use in a conventional war that really matters. And also what Russia's nuclear saber rattling during the Ukraine war recently demonstrated is a nuclear power doesn't have to explicitly threaten nuclear use. It can make various nuclear signaling that are very ambiguous, very implicit, but still have the benefit of imposed coercive power on the other side. So I think, how do we manage that? Nuclear signaling below the nuclear level threshold, but still would affect all the three countries' threat perception and may drive their peacetime nuclear strategy development, capability development. I've been going on for too long, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
No, that was great, Tong. A lot of issues on the table. Rabia, I'm going to go straight to you. And again, same challenge to talk a little bit about the report, the Pakistani dynamic, but also this interactive dynamic, because there's this cascade effect down the chain of countries. Please.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this great event with brilliant fellow panelists to discuss this incredible book. I won't call it a report. I don't know why Carnegie keeps on calling it a report, on how nuclear transitions in Southern Asia, to include China and then Pakistan, are affecting the overall strategic stability in Southern Asia. I limit my remarks to the chapter, but let me state at the outset that if you're a Pakistani scholar who's right now present and listening, you're an expert or an academic from Pakistan who's been studying Pakistan's nuclear evolution, then there is much to be happy about what Tellis has written and how he has analyzed Pakistan's nuclear evolution and trajectory I think I've yet to read a more articulate description of Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence, which everybody seems to be confused about, than what Tellis has provided. So if you're still confused about FSD, please read his book. And in order to arrive at that point where he could so aptly deconstruct Pakistan's rationale of a shift from credible minimum deterrence to full spectrum deterrence, Tellis has anchored his analysis in Pakistan's threat perceptions and insecurities since 1947 when it came into being, leading to 1971 when it broke into two and ambitiously pursued nuclear weapons capability, leading to its overt nuclearization in 1998. I believe that Tellis has masterfully threaded Pakistan's obsession with security, lending legitimacy to its acquisition of nuclear weapons, enough to say that the world should be rest assured nuclear weapons are here to stay. And he believes that even if the world gives up nuclear weapons, a move towards general nuclear disarmament, it might be difficult for Pakistan to give them up. And the rationale he explains rest with Pakistan's strategy of first use and last resort, and the logic holds that since Pakistan wants to deter a full-fledged conventional war with India, which it fears will spiral to nuclear escalation, and nobody knows where it will stop, is logic enough for Pakistan to hold on to its nuclear weapons? Debatable, but I would give it to you. The historian in me also agrees with Tellis's assessment of the asymmetry between, for example, Pakistan and US in early Cold War alliance commitments, with huge differences in the perceived versus the stated objectives, which led to mutual grievances later on. And what was seen as betrayal at Pakistan's end was not the stated objective of the alliance in the first place. I, however, have several reservations, which, if the chair permits, I like, tell us to comment on when we get to our conversation. Tell us your assessment about Pakistan's expanding its nuclear arsenal to counter threats perceived from India and the United States. While, as you rightly argue in the book, post 9/11, given its proximity to Pakistan with boots on ground, Pakistan did fear US attempts at neutralizing Pakistani nuclear arsenal if the risk of nuclear terrorism was real and emanating from Pakistan. However, at no point in time did Pakistan contemplate expanding its nuclear arsenal to have missiles that would deter the US or Israel for that matter. And for those who raise this flag of Pakistan having contingencies attacking Israel that supposedly Shaheen 3 can reach, I would like to ask this one question. Do you know what's the distance between Israel and Saudi Arabia? It's a 15 hours drive from Israel to Mecca, and 15 hours drive by car, that is. And in any scenario, no matter how ridiculous it is, Pakistan will not attack Israel with nuclear weapons because it would be akin to destroying Mecca in the process. So let me rest that here now. There is also a very thin and flimsy evidence which you have used, citing a couple of articles, which further, when I explored, have cited Congressman Ted Poe in one of his congressional hearings, saying that China is helping Pakistan build an ICBM, which is to target the USA. It's really, there's just no other evidence other than, Congressman Ted Poe's rant against China. There is no program that Pakistan has which is geared towards developing ICBMs for US or Israel, and Pakistan's program is as India-centric as it was from the day it was conceived, with the only rationale being that there will never be another 1971 for Pakistan. And Pakistan has remained true to that ambition, which its nuclear weapons have been serving since beyond 1998, assuring the survival of this, as you rightly put, historically bruised state. Your book expands on Pakistan's declaratory policy, which remains true to its intent since 1998. Pakistan has exemplified, number one, a commitment to restraint. Number two, has shown a solid commitment towards stabilization of strategic deterrence stabilization, whereby you rightly point out that Pakistan's threat of nuclear first use, in contrast to both China and India and their declaratory doctrine, has functioned as Pakistan's solution for ensuring the stabilization of regional deterrence. I think that's beautifully articulated. However, Here I would like to draw the attention of US first use doctrine, which despite it being the most powerful or having strategic parity with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, was never related to US national self-preservation. And when Pakistan's no NFU is analyzed, it is related to its relative weakness and is only understood in that context. And lastly, you say that Pakistan program being India-centric, India's centrality in Pakistan's calculations continue to remain, and I appreciate that analysis. At the operational level, your book argues that Pakistan's relative conventional asymmetry via India compels it to think of nuclear weapons as usable military instruments, where in addition to their sheer presence, their employability is also considered in event of major conflict. I would like to draw a comparison again with the US, what the US is doing now, building low yield nuclear weapons to increase their battlefield use and employability to strengthen its deterrence. However, I appreciate in your analysis, Tellis, that Pakistan's first use and last resort scenario, you are empathetic to Pakistan's need for having these nuclear weapons so that unacceptable damage could be threatened at all possible levels. Your assessment of Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence is spot on, as I mentioned earlier, and perhaps one of the best I've read lately, whereby Pakistan has ensured and established deterrence at all levels, taking it from the strategic levels down to the very pits. However, for me, there isn't much gap between CMD and FSD. It is still minimum numbers required for counter value, minimum numbers required for counter force, and minimum numbers required for battlefield use. And like your chapter suggests, it is all relative. It is not like China and India are stopping or have drawn a final number. So, you're saying that the shift from credible minimum deterrence to full spectrum deterrence is portentous, is a bit of a stretch to me. The discussion on Pakistan's tight negative use control in peacetime and effective positive control is also very interesting. You maintain that all nuclear states are confronted by these requirements, but Pakistan even more so because of the value of its nuclear weapons derived from its willingness to actually use them if conventional, deterrence break down and we spiral. I would like to, have your views about Pulwama Balakot crisis, where I believe that crisis termination rested squarely with Pakistan and doesn't get acknowledged much for it. I appreciate how you rightly contextualize the asymmetry, and it is not overblown to suggest that Pakistan actually enjoys significant conventional force advantages along the border with India on a day-to-day basis, thereby averting the possibility of any dramatic defeat early in a conventional conflict. And this is where, we need to draw confidence from. There is my fifth point. There is a lot of discussion in this book on counterforce and counter value targeting. And I always wonder, given the sheer size of our countries, Pakistan being much smaller in mass than India, there can be no clear distinction of counterforce and counter value. Any distinction that is being made is merely theoretical because the realities on ground with our population sizes and mass centers, any counterforce will and cannot remain counterforce even if it has the highest form of precision. So perhaps we need to debate more on the lines that blur here and drop this Cold War distinction, which I believe does not fit, especially the Indo-Pak nuclear dyad. But while we're discussing this distinction, my question to you, Tellis, is that why does Pakistan need to move away from counter value towards counter force, as you suggest, given Pakistan's development of tactical nuclear weapons? Why can't it launch simultaneous attacks? The logic that counter value will lead to quicker crisis termination will hold for all times to come. And war termination is a goal worth pursuing at all costs. Overall, your chapter on Pakistan's nuclear evolution trajectory is brilliantly articulated, takes head on Clary Naran's work and decimates it by stating, and I would like to hear their end of assessment of your assessment of their work, by stating that India's shift to counterforce preemptive first use is not happening and is convincing in its arguments. The only thing I'm not sold is, the overall discussion on Pakistan expanding its nuclear deterrent ambit to include US, and I don't find much evidence for it. Lastly, you know, um, the one thing that you've talked about is technological determinism, which is not at play in Southern Asia, and more specifically in case of Pakistan. Nuclear weapons of all these countries are not tailored to strategy, but the strategy is shaping to suit their weapons. And that gels with the fact that the core goal here is deterrent stability and avoidance of crisis instability. And I believe you've brilliantly articulated it, and I would urge everybody to read this report. Thank you so much once again for writing it. I look forward to our conversation.
Okay, thanks, Rabia. You put a lot of issues on the table. I'm just going to keep the train moving, and I'm going to go straight to Rakesh. But Rakesh, you have to unmute yourself.
No? And Ashley, congratulations on this book. You beat me to it. I have a chapter coming out on precisely this just a couple of months from now. It's under review. And but then that's a chapter and this is a book. But then at the same time, I mean, since Tong is here, I can't help but mention that, we looked at the China, India, Pakistan, and as you know, Brookings came out with a report where Tong was there and General Kidwai was there and, and there were various other people. And that Brookings report came out where we actually used the word strategic chains to look at China, India, Pakistan, because we said that the time of looking at nuclear theology and deterrence issues in the context of simple nuclear dyads is now passé, because even if you try and look at them in terms of two-player games, somewhere these dyads are interlinked and in some fashion or the other. Now, so we came up with this notion of strategic chains which have loose ties or loose correlations. But nonetheless, none of this takes away from the value of what you have put in, because I think you have had an exceedingly good analysis and an exceedingly good understanding of the dynamics of China, India, Pakistan. You've dealt with it for decades. You've been in the region. You've met with the people. So clearly, there is a lot of value in all of that. And I think what makes it different from other writings on this issue is that you actually, for the first time, you make a distinction between strategic stability and nuclear stability in the context of China, India, India, Pakistan, which is where you bring in the fact that there are certain conventional balances, and that is perhaps why uh, you don't see the same equations in deterrence terms, or neither do you see the same crisis issues. You do see some crisis issues, but the reasons for those are different. So it's very different from the US Soviet, because after all, the whole nuclear age and the whole deterrence theology, the arms control theology, the nuclear order, all of that comes in with the bipolar world, with the US Soviet bipolar equation and all the learnings that arise from that. So, from that point of view, I think this is extremely important, intellectual, groundbreaking aspects of what you've talked about. And I think what is interesting here is also the word, which again we've used, of asymmetry. See, the US Soviet model of deterrence and arms control was based upon a certain symmetry and a certain, I would say the other word was parity. Now, while all three countries, as you have rightly said, are in a stage of transition, as you pointed out, because they're all expanding their arsenals, they're all looking at what each other is doing, and China, of course, is also looking at what the United States is doing. But then they are at different stages. Even even with this developments that are taking place in their arsenals, there is still no notion of parity or even approaching that kind of notion, nor is there a notion of symmetry or approaching that. And so, one lesson that it gives us very clearly is that arms control of the kind that has been traditionally practiced doesn't seem to work. In fact, it is not even working so far as we can see, even in the US Russia case, where at least the arsenals have a certain symmetry, but that's a whole different set of issues. But what I'm saying is that in this context, the traditional arms control approaches don't seem to work. Why? Because there is, as you have rightly identified, there is a certain degree of deterrence stability. Partly because whether it is on the India China issue or India Pakistan, the balance of conventional forces is such that there is a certain semblance of deterrence stability, and that is not really getting upset till we get to some of those technological challenges which you have really sought to identify in your conclusions and so on. Second, because we are at different stages, because these three countries are at different stages of their nuclear developments and so on, even as they develop, there is still no arms race instability. Even in the absence of any arms control talks of the kind that that were the characteristic of US Soviet arms control agreements. Even in the absence of that, you don't really have arms control instability. So what do you have? Why does it create concern? I think one reason it creates concern is because of the whole crisis management issue. Because between US and Soviet Union, there was a crisis management stability mechanisms that were put into play. Now, how successful they were, we can always debate about it and things like that. But nonetheless, the proof is that we are still alive, and the US and the Soviet Union didn't nuke each other and all of us at the same time. So, to that extent, the crisis management mechanisms were in play. Now, today, the issue is that we don't have that comfort. And so, therefore, there is a certain concern about the absence of these crisis management mechanisms. And I think ultimately, I do believe that that is something which we need to focus on quite clearly. Now, if you look at the India China, now, as you've identified, there is a relative similarity in their approach to deterrence. And I think that helps. With India, Pakistan, there is a divergence because, as you said, Pakistan is looking at it. I mean, for India, it is a question of trying to expand the space between conventional and nuclear. You kind of raise the threshold so high that you have space for conventional retaliation. For Pakistan, because the role of nuclear weapons is quite different, it wants to squeeze it and bring the threshold down so that, and hence the tactical approaches and so on. So it is that particular asymmetry, which is where some of these tensions and therefore the additional requirement or the greater requirement of crisis management comes in. Finally, I would say, if since when even opened it and he spoke about the nuclear order, and since we want to talk about that, I think overall, I would venture to submit that the nuclear order is based on, as we have known, it was based on three things. I mean, one is the nuclear taboo, and now the taboo was essentially normative. The taboo strength lies in the fact that nuclear weapons were never used since 1945, and so that gives it a normative power. The second was the arms control structure, which is largely nuclear dyadic or US Soviet Union based. And but that is more or less now collapsing. And the third is the non-proliferation architecture. And right now, the NPT review conference is taking place. And we know that the NPT is also a little bit creaky, I mean, to put it mildly. So I think that if there is one lesson that we need to take from this, is that we need to ensure that the taboo, in some fashion or the other, does not get breached. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Rakesh, and thanks all. So, Ashley, there's a lot on the table. The panelists have had questions for you. We already have some audience questions coming in. I have a few questions. So I think let's just play it loose and have a discussion. I have one question I wanted to start with, which Tong teased in his presentation, which is this question around escalation control in the dyads and then across the three countries that are at the focus of the book. And there are a lot of ways to think about escalation control, but there are two that are kind of nagging at me as I'm listening to the discussion. So one, I mean, the three countries that you profile have, in some cases, fought each other force on force at the conventional level: India, China, India, Pakistan. So one way to come at this is the question of whether nuclear possession gives a country the opportunity to escalate at the conventional level with the assurance that there's a nuclear deterrence in the background. This is an issue when I worked on North Korea that was always in the background, right? They would sink a boat, they would shell an island, and there was always the question of whether nuclear possession incentivized the North Koreans somehow to think they could escalate with impunity at the conventional level. So that's one way to think about the problem of escalation among countries that have actually fought each other at the conventional level, force on force. The flip is something that I think we've gotten another taste of, Tong, in the last week or so between the US and China, which is there's a lot of loose war talk about the US and China fighting each other at the conventional level without a lot of parallel thinking about escalation control, how to prevent the conventional war from escalating to the nuclear level. And so there's that way of coming at escalation control as well. Not just does nuclear possession give these countries the opportunity to escalate conventionally, but how then do you preclude that conventional warfare from escalating to the nuclear level? How much do you think these three capitals are thinking about escalation control, and how confident are you that either in conventional war scenarios or more generally, that the kind of breaks that one would need to prevent what you called political weapons from becoming warfighting weapons, or the flip, that they're political, but they have they actually have an operational effect because they give countries the opportunity to escalate conventionally. How are you thinking about that as you come out of writing this book?
So I think that varies depending on the dyad in question. But let me sort of step back and put a few thoughts on the table. I think all three countries believe that the possession of their nuclear weapons provides them immunity against the worst kind of war that can be inflicted on them. I think that is common through to all three countries. As Tong pointed out, because China really is focused on the US, the requirements for what could be considered sufficient are obviously increasing. That has certain impacts on India and then by implication impacts on Pakistan. But I think in all three countries, there is a sense that nuclear weapons are critical devices to prevent war from breaking out. Now the question arises as to if war still occurs in the context, of these beliefs, how do you handle conflict? And here I think you get Pakistan on one end and China and India on the other end. So Pakistan, to my mind, is the exemplar of the first case that you identified, which is Pakistan sees its nuclear weapons as protecting it against conflict, but also freeing it to pursue subconventional conflicts against India. I don't think Pakistan views its nuclear weapons as permitting it to prosecute conventional wars against India. I think that's a bridge too far. But I think the Pakistani state thinks that we have enough immunity, we have nuclear weapons, so we can support insurgencies and so on and so forth. And there's very little that India can do about it uh, in terms of counteraction, right? So that's your first case scenario where it's less deterrence and it becomes more of license. I think the second category of how do you prevent conventional wars, which are precipitated by acute political crises, from becoming nuclear crises, I think that matters to all three countries, but in different contexts. For China, of course, the big question is going to be what happens in the case of a war in Taiwan. Will the United States attempt to hold at risk Chinese nuclear forces as part of its strategy of protecting Taiwan? I think that's the big question at the Chinese end. At the Indian and Pakistani end, I think the real issue is, will both sides, in the context of a conventional conflict, maintain certain fire breaks with respect to things they will and will not do? And the big question to my mind then becomes, will India attempt to attack Pakistani nuclear forces in the context of this conflict? My own view is no. And a significant portion of the report actually focuses on claims that India is in fact targeting Pakistani nuclear forces, which I think is both technically impossible today and certainly not part of India's calculus. And then at the Pakistani end, I think I don't see any interest in Pakistan's targeting India's nuclear forces, because it doesn't have to. If there is a conventional war, Pakistan is going to be fighting to protect its own territory against Indian conventional incursions. And the last thing on Pakistan's mind is going to be some counter-force attacks on India's nuclear forces. So I think your framing is actually a very good one, but you have to sort of dig down to look at each of the countries and the specific context in which those contingencies become relevant.
Yeah. Rakesh, I was going to say, I want this to be interactive. So just stick your hand up.
No. I will just take from what Ashley said. And it's very interesting looking at the way you framed your question and looking at the way Ashley addressed it. If you noticed, he addressed it in the context of US, China, and India, Pakistan. Now, you notice that with US, China, there is a degree of asymmetry in terms of doctrinal approaches and other things. India, Pakistan, again, there is that asymmetry. Now, Ashley didn't talk about so much in terms of the India-China. And that is curious because there is an element of symmetry there in terms of the nuclear issue doesn't get tickled as much despite the tensions between India and China. So perhaps somewhere in that asymmetry lies the answer to your question. Just a thought, and I will stop here and let the others.
Okay. So Ashley, something like Galwan or all of it, we shouldn't worry, therefore, about that escalation brakes are not in place.
I think so, because ultimately escalation is not
better already.
Yeah, it's not a mechanical evolution.
No,
right?
obviously.
Yeah, it's driven by political objectives. And my argument in the book is that Chinese and Indian political objectives vis-a-vis each other are relatively limited. And because they are limited, you're unlikely to see even major conventional military operations that end up threatening security in any fundamental ways. And therefore, that automatically puts a lid on nuclear escalation in the India-China context. And that's the reason why I did not think it's significant enough to address it in the context of the question.
I think one other aspect is neither China nor India looks at each other as an existential threat.
Do you see that? Do you see any symptoms? Go ahead, sorry.
But as you have yourself mentioned, I mean, Pakistan sees the role that Pakistan has given to its nuclear arsenal. Pakistan sees India as an existential threat. Now, rightly, wrongly, we don't want to get into that at this stage. But for whatever reason, that's the way you've analyzed it, and Rabia also endorsed that kind of an approach. So fair enough. So I think that's where the difference lies. Now, when US China look at it, then they are looking at who's going to be the top dog. So once again, it becomes quite existential in that sense. And I think that is where the difference is. And that's where Galwan, yes, I mean, it has led to tremendous tension in the relationship and all the rest of it. But there is no nuclear saber rattling. I mean, like Tong said, he said that when he talked of nuclear threats. Now, at no stage in the India China case were any nuclear threats. There was no nuclear saber rattling. But you look at India Pakistan, I mean, there is hell of a lot of loose talk. People sort of start doing this nuclear saber rattling and all that kind of nonsense, which doesn't help in this, in the overall situation. So I think there is a little element of that. Okay.
Okay. There's a couple of questions coming in the chat. And one is about, I guess, the forgotten player here, which is Russia. Russia having a longstanding relationship with India, including a military relationship, a strategic relationship. There's been some footsie going on between Pakistan and Russia over the last couple of years, especially in the last government, the Imran Khan government. So the question is really about how India and Pakistan's relationships with Russia and the US, respectively, might affect this trilateral dynamic or any of these dyadic dynamics. Actually, I don't know if you want to take a crack at that.
I think that's a really big question. And I think the impact on the nuclear dimensions of the China-India-Pakistan relationship are actually minimal. Russia is a political actor. China has a particular relationship with Russia. India has had a long-standing friendship with Russia. Pakistan has been trying to put its relations with Russia on an even keel. And obviously, Russia is a major concern for the United States, including the developments in its nuclear program. But I think the developments in the Russian nuclear program have a peripheral impact on certainly India and Pakistan. And if they have an impact on China, I think it is very highly recessed. Because given the state of Sino-Russian relations today, even if the Chinese are concerned about Russia's nuclear modernization at a technological level, they are certainly showing no signs of alluding to that publicly. And that's because the politics really determines, I think, China's approach to this question.
And all of the Russian nuclear saber rattling in Ukraine, to Rakesh's point about the nuclear taboo, has that had any erosion effect on thinking in any of the three countries, or none? It's just seen as situational.
Well, I would like to hear Tong's view on this and Rakesh's view on this, but my view is that we have not seen the end of this story yet. We don't know what's going to happen because this is an ongoing conflict. But certainly in India, and I would argue even in Pakistan, they could not welcome Russian saber rattling, no matter how justified it may be from Moscow's perspective. I suspect this is also true for China, because China has been very sort of cautious about talking about nuclear weapons and, issuing nuclear threats. In fact, when I was writing the report, I looked at all the cases of nuclear threats since 1945. And I could not find a single instance where China has issued a nuclear threat. China has been a victim of nuclear threats issued by the United States on many an occasion. But there has never been an instance of China actually issuing a nuclear threat. And so I cannot imagine, if I was sitting in Beijing, how I could welcome Russian nuclear saber rattling and the Russian attempts to sort of rhetorically use nuclear weapons for political effects in the Ukraine crisis.
Tong, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I think, of course, China is a bit worried about, the Ukraine war escalating further, even across the nuclear threshold. But most Chinese observers seem to see the Russian nuclear cyber rattling as very clever nuclear signaling tactics, right? And I think they believe the result is positive, right? Without explicitly threatening nuclear use, simply by conducting nuclear exercises, um, conducting tests of nuclear delivery systems, um, careful reference to nuclear capabilities by senior leaders, and even the showing of the Russian so-called nuclear briefcase on Russian TV was viewed in China as a very subtle and clever nuclear signaling. But all of these appear to work from the Chinese perspective. They did dissuade NATO countries from, or at least slowed their provision of certain military assistance to Ukraine and imposing certain economic punishments on Russia. So, but judging by how Chinese observers are watching Russian signaling, I think there might be lessons learned which would be applied to future U.S.-China conventional conflicts, especially over the Taiwan Strait. So I do think there will be implications.
Can I ask Tom? Tom, can I ask you a question on this? Are you saying that the Russian attempts at signaling, in whatever form they've done, are producing sort of effects beyond just the possession of nuclear weapons? In other words, even if Russia did none of this stuff, would the West be tempted to cross certain thresholds with respect to assistance to Ukraine? So where is the causal effectiveness coming from? Is it coming from the signaling, or is it coming simply from the possession of the weapons?
I think the Chinese observation is a lot of this comes from the nuclear signaling. Right? Many European countries even claim that Russia has, directly threatened nuclear use. Putin's reference to nuclear weapons, even though it shouldn't be read, I think, as a direct threat of nuclear use, but it produces such an impression in many countries, and I think China agrees with that observation. And similarly, you said, China never itself threatened nuclear use, but in the recipient countries, maybe the impression is different. Right? During the recent Taiwan crisis, some people said, the Chinese revelation of the test of the testing image, the launching image of its DF-17 hypersonic boost guider missile, which was reported by some American government agencies as nuclear capable. Some read that as a Chinese nuclear signal. And some Indian experts think that the Chinese showing on Chinese TV of the exercises of DF-31AG missile in regions close to the Indian border was an implicit nuclear signal to India as a result of the Galvan Valley conflict. So I think it depends on interpretation of implicit signals.
Hey guys, can we talk about the China-Pakistan relationship for a second? Rabia addressed this in part by dismissing some of the speculation about the China-Pakistan military and technological relationship. But of course, there are longstanding military and technological dimensions to that relationship. And I guess since that's developed in some new directions under the last few governments in Pakistan, I'm curious whether this is a question for Rabia and Ashley and Rakesh, I guess, as well. Whether the nature, scope, intensity, and trajectory of the China-Pakistan relationship is stabilizing or destabilizing from the standpoint of deterrence, particularly India-Pakistan deterrence, but also India-China deterrence.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Please.
I'm still waiting for Ashley to talk about the ICBM, though. So probably we can get to that later. With respect to there is I did not deny that Pakistan and China have a strategic relationship and very strong defense ties. I think it is India's assessment of as to what this relationship is about is what determines as to the kind of narrative that is generated. I think Pakistan at this point in time, needs to have conventional deterrence in place, more so than nuclear deterrence, because that is already established and there is strategic parity at the top. Uh, More Pakistan moves towards conventional deterrence and strengthening it, that's where China comes in, because China defense ties are stronger and getting stronger by the day. That's I don't see that having an effect on Pakistan's nuclear deterrence, because, like I see, that's already established. But with respect to conventional deterrence, there's a lot of scope to be worked at, and it's I'd like to hear how Rakesh sees that relationship affecting India Pakistan's nuclear deterrence dynamics. However, I don't see that much of a relationship there. Just one more comment, if you allow me, Evan, on escalation control. So I believe that up until Pulwama Balakot, there had been some sort of outsourcing of this escalation control happening to just to the third party, and the back channels. So India and Pakistan would reach a point where, they would think that it would compel third parties to come in and stop both countries, and that's how they outsource escalation control to third parties. And I think there's a mention of this by Ashley itself as to how Pakistan decided to be independent with respect to nuclear weapons, but then this reliance on third parties in crisis termination and management has sort of brought back its reliance on third parties rather than making it free and independent, with respect to that. And one point in Russia, uh, I do believe that, there is a potential of this conversation shifting from South Asia being a nuclear flashpoint to, Asia and Europe. But with respect to the use of nuclear weapons, I believe that there's no country, including Russia, who would deliberately use nuclear weapons. Yes, accidents, inadvertent, use will always remain, a reality, and that can happen. But deliberate nuclear use won't happen. And as far as nuclear signaling goes, this is probably the first time in history that any country has used as many number of threats during a crisis, a conflict, as Russia has done. So that's that. Thank you.
Okay, Ashley, do you want maybe Ashley and Rakesh? I don't know if you each of you.
Sure. Let me come back to the question of the ICBM, which Rabia raised. I think the three aspects here that we need to separate conceptually. One is, did Pakistan toy with the idea of building an ICBM? That's question number one. Question number two is, did Pakistan receive assistance from the outside, whether it's China or elsewhere? And then three, what is the US role, if any, in the ICBM story? So on question number one, I think Pakistan did toy with developing an ICBM. And what I found striking, actually, by looking at the literature, were the number of references to reports about Pakistan attempting to develop ICBMs, particularly in the first few years of the last decade. And I think that was driven primarily by fears about the United States, and the fears that the United States really had ill intentions towards Pakistan's nuclear program. This was colored very much by our presence in Afghanistan, the Abbottabad crisis, and so on and so forth. And it ties to a larger question of how Pakistan responded to these fears about possible US intervention in its nuclear program. So on the first question, did Pakistan toy with the idea of having an ICBM? I have no doubt that it did. And I think it was a serious effort that was made primarily for prudential reasons. I mean, no one's crazy enough to believe that the Pakistanis would start thinking of, splendid first strikes on the United States, right? I mean, that's sort of beyond the pale of imagination. But Pakistan wanted to be able to hold at risk any threats that it might encounter. So that's question number one. Question number two, was there a Chinese connection? That, honestly, I don't know the answer to. I know that Congressman Poe raised that. In fact, it's kind of interesting. When I met him for the first time many years ago, and we were talking about Afghanistan, it's in fact one of the questions he asked me. I don't know for a fact whether the Chinese were involved in the assistance to a Pakistani ICBM program. My own view is that the Pakistani missile program now is so far advanced that if Pakistan wanted to build an ICBM, it could build an ICBM entirely on the strength of its own domestic capabilities. It has the technical capacities to build an ICBM without any assistance from the outside. I don't think that is a controversial statement. The third question is really, did the US do anything at all about an ICBM program? And the sort of argument I make in the book, and I know this for a fact because I spoke to officials in the Obama years who were very concerned about the Pakistani ICBM program. And I was told that Secretary Kerry raised this with the Pakistanis during one of his, numerous visits. And we don't know what happened after that. There's no public reporting about what happened after that. But the fact that, if this is true, if Secretary Kerry did in fact raise it, then I think it suggests that the US was concerned enough to have raised the issue with the Pakistanis. One can speculate about various, calculations that went into this kind of a démarche, but to my mind, there is absolutely no doubt that the Pakistanis did toy with the idea of building an ICBM. I don't know if it's an active program anymore, but these are capabilities that are latent in Pakistan's sort of technology base. And between its dedicated missile program and between the SLV, the space launch vehicles in the space program, if Pakistan wanted to go in this direction, it could do so without too much difficulty.
Hey, Ashley, Rakesh, you want to jump in?
Well,
I'm watching the clock. So
yeah. Well, I just wanted to say that the China-Pakistan relationship has to be looked at with a certain long-term perspective. China has traditionally dealt with the Pakistan army because of the defense nuclear missile relationship way back going into the 80s, 90s, right? So the army was their key client. They didn't bother too much about the political parties and all the rest of it. Then, of course, came the whole Uyghur issue, the terrorist business, the Turkmen, ETIM and all of that. So once again, it was dealing with the ISI, in other words, the army, which was relevant. Now there is a qualitative, and it kind of cemented ties, the whole business of stronger than steel, closer than lips, sweeter than honey, higher than mountains, deeper than the oceans, and all of that. But now what has happened with the economic relationship, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, is that there is a different dimension to that relationship. It's, it's no longer just limited to the army. So it is much wider. It is much more comprehensive. And that changes the complexion. While, I may go along with Ashley on the ICBM, this thing, I think, but let's say if Pakistan tomorrow chooses to develop a MER capability, I certainly would not be surprised at all if there would not be some Chinese little fingerprints or something like that on it. It's quite clear. So it's a question of what, but at the same time, I don't see that, I think so far as we see it today, in the past, if you go back to Kargil, China was not supportive of Pakistan in the 1999 Kargil conflict. In fact, China told Pakistan that, look, what are you doing? I mean, you are trying to upset the territorial status quo. This is not the way to go about it. So you back off. But then that was a different China. The India China relationship was different at that time. The India US relationship was different at that time. Today, A, it is a different China. B, it is a different India China relationship. And C, it is a different India US relationship with Quad and all the rest of it. So, the backdrop against which we have to answer the question that you posed is shifting. And I think we have to look at it from that point of view. So, what was perhaps valid in 1999, whether it would still be valid or not in 2022 or 2025, it's tough to say.
Okay, thanks. So, Ashley, we're coming up on time, but I do want to use a last segment to give you and the others the opportunity to be prescriptive as well as being analytical. And for the audience, I'll tell you, Ashley's a great colleague for so many reasons, but one of them is he's not just an amazing analyst, but he's fantastically prescriptive, and he's always prescriptive, whether you share his prescriptions or not. So there are a couple of questions that are coming in from audience members, and I think they fall into two broad prescriptive categories. So let me just put these on the table. So one gets at the issue Rakesh raised around risk reduction and crisis management. It's essentially the way the question's phrased, it's very blunt. So I'm actually going to steal the question. If you had to pick just one, and you don't have to limit yourself to one, but if you had to pick one, what would you consider to be the most effective trilateral, or not just trilateral, multilateral or bilateral risk reduction measure that could be taken to reduce nuclear risks in Southern Asia, the geography you have in mind in this book? And then second, I mean, Ashley, you and I are sitting in the United States. Tong is in Washington today. So there's this question around US interests and how the United States should respond, if at all, to this complex trilateral nuclear dynamic. So let me put those two on the table: risk reduction measures, crisis management, and mitigation, and then the interest and role of the United States. And I'm going to start with Ashley, and then when you finish, we'll give anybody else a last word, and then we'll bring it home. Ashley.
So if just based on the work in the report, if there was any one thing that I think would make a difference to stability and would be worth having a conversation about, I don't know whether you can negotiate an agreement, would be to maintain the arsenals in relatively demated condition. Because the biggest threat that I see to instability in the years ahead is the shift to rapid retaliation as being the new posture. It just creates enormous opportunities for accidents, for mistaken decisions, particularly in the context of time pressures. And so if we could find some way to wind the clock back to the 1998 posture in all three countries, which is to keep your nuclear assets, but to keep them in relatively distributed form, that would be fantastic. This may be asking for the moon, but I think it's the only thing that'll make a difference. All the rest will be rhetorical. So you can negotiate no first use, you can negotiate, intimation of tests. Well, it's a good thing to intimate tests. I mean, I don't see any downside to that. But if you're asking me for a structural solution that will make a difference to acute instability, the only structural solution is essentially to keep long burn fuses on the nuclear capabilities that are being developed.
You want to comment on the role of the United States?
I see very little. I mean, the role for the United States varies depending on country to country, right? With respect to China, I think we need to begin to have conversations whereby we provide mutual reassurance that we are not going to target Chinese nuclear forces in the context of a conventional conflict over Taiwan. I think that is a reasonable position for the United States to take, and it's something that we ought to do simply because it makes for crisis stability. With respect to India, I think we're going to have some very difficult decisions to make in the out years, because as I argue in the report, India will at some point have to go back to nuclear testing. And if it goes back to nuclear testing, then there are going to be implications for the things that Evan, you and I worked on, which was the civil nuclear agreement, because there are many issues in the agreement that will be impeded by that testing. And with respect to Pakistan, we've already made terrific gains with respect to both nuclear security and nuclear surety. So I would like to continue those conversations with Pakistan once things get back on an even keel. But there's not really much more that we need to do with Pakistan or its nuclear program.
You've given me flashbacks both to Vienna and to being hammered by Congressman Howard Berman about questions around nuclear testing. So let's, it's a long time ago, but they're vivid. Why don't we do this? Let's go backwards through the panel. And I want you each to have a chance to weigh in on this prescriptive question. So we'll start with Rakesh, then we'll go Rabia and then come to Tong.
Well, regarding the risk reduction, I think, Ashley is right in the sense of lengthening the fuse, but then how do you do it? Practically speaking, there is no dialogue. I don't think we can have a trilateral dialogue between China, India, and Pakistan at this stage. The most we can hope for is two bilaterals, okay? India, China don't have a dialogue. We have had a sporadic thing at track 2, pure track 2, but I don't think it exists any longer. But we would need to have that in order to move to some kind of, even achieving at lengthening the fuse or things like that, or that should be actually easier because there is a symmetry in terms of no first use. So even if we just exchange these homilies about saying, why are you worried? We have a no first use, and no, you shouldn't be worried because we also have a no first use. Well, that's fine, but at least people start to get talking. With India, Pakistan, we have had track 2s. In fact, later this week, I'm supposed to be doing a track 2 nuclear dialogue with Pakistan. So, but we don't have any track 1, or at least nothing really substantive in that sense. So it is the absence of this dialogue that creates, gray areas. Regarding how the US can respond, I think the US has its hands full in terms of managing the China relationship first and foremost. And I think it would probably be too much on US's plate to expect it to look at the China and it's, can't walk and chew gum at the same time. So I'll just let the US focus on the China relationship for the moment.
Okay. Rabia.
I'll just be brief. I think with respect to emerging technologies, like these countries, like Pakistan and India, have this no attack on each other's nuclear facilities. CBM. We could probably have a trilateral CBM or even bilateral, like Rakesh rightly said, that India and China are not talking at the strategic level. Probably Pakistan and India can have a conversation about cyber attack on command and control of each other's countries. That's the conversation starter. And if the strategic dialogues are rehabilitated between India and Pakistan, I think this is one area where we need to sit down and say, let this be a no-go area for deterrent stability.
Tong, prescription on risk reduction?
Well, given the time limit, I wouldn't go into too much detail, but I would note that in Ashley's excellent book regarding the role of the United States, he did propose the 2 specific and interesting prescriptions. One is, he basically alerts the United States that India might eventually need to resume testing and in order to possess reliable high-yield nuclear warhead capability, so as to stabilize, for the long term, China-India nuclear relationship. And secondly, he proposed that, in this case, U.S. shouldn't freak out and and maybe had better keep silent if I understand Ashley's proposal correctly. And second is again to stabilize long-term China-India deterrence relationship. Maybe countries like the U.S. and France could help India with nuclear submarine technology, with the eventual goal of helping India build better SSB and nuclear ballistic missile submarine capability. These are indeed, very intriguing and bold, and some people would say controversial propositions that are offered at the very end of this book. I think they do have very significant geopolitical and non-proliferation implications. I do hope we have time to debate those issues in more details.
Well, that teases
I deliberately didn't comment on these two issues for the simple reason that we would be taking this discussion forward by another 30 minutes at least.
No, we've teased a follow-up event. And as Ashley said, this question of prospective Indian nuclear testing. If we rewind the clock to 2008, Ashley will remember this was one of the central debates, both at the Nuclear Suppliers Group and on Capitol Hill, and between the Congress and the executive branch. So it is a big issue. Ashley, before I do a summation, I just want to give you the opportunity to have the last word and also to respond to anything that you may have heard that you want to weigh in on.
No, nothing really, Evan. I just want to thank, folks who've joined us virtually, and of course my fellow panelists, and for you for leading this discussion. And as Rabia said, just read the report. It's not a page turner. It'll put you to sleep. But on those nights when you've run out of sheep to count, this is a good book to have by your nightstand.
All right. Well, you stole my thunder, because that was essentially my summation. So I was going to say three things. So first, I want to thank everybody, Ashley above all, for writing the book, but also for bringing us together, since you're the reason for it. And then Rabia, Tong, Rakesh for joining us and giving us the opportunity both to celebrate Ashley and to have a serious discussion of his work. Second, I can't think of a more important set of issues, frankly. As we've heard, this is very dynamic. It's not a static picture, and it's only going to become more so. And then Ashley stole my thunder on the third and most important point, which is read this book. Read the book. It's on the Carnegie Endowment website, carnegieendowment.org. It's free, it's downloadable, and it's terrific. And so I encourage everybody, both on and off the live stream, to go to the website and read it. And it is a page turner, especially if you're in this business. Maybe if you're not in this business, but if you're in this business, it's a terrific, and as I said at the beginning, it's going to be a definitive piece of work. So congratulations, Ashley. Thank you, everybody. And to everybody in the audience, thanks for joining us, and thanks for spending time with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.